Fighting games might be considered niche in the grand scheme of things when we consider the large ecosystem that is the gaming industry, but there are hundreds of developers working hard to produce these games in the hopes that the fans will love them. This passion has spurred people to great heights and the pushing of the boundaries of these games. But for every successful fighting game, there's a tale of woe for another proposed game that never got to see the light of day or may have gotten some leaked release but is not the complete game. These are the games we will be talking about today. Welcome to another DashFight video, and today we're going to be delving into the world of canceled fighting games. We'll examine the games, learn about their background, and why they got cut. There are loads of them, so we definitely can't get to everyone, but we'll do our best. Let's get started. Vicious Circle was an Atari game that was developed in the mid-90s. The game was proposed to run on Atari's Kojak arcade system, which, amongst other things, came with a hard drive which was to house the heavier graphical elements needed for the game. A lot of Vicious Circle was made with CGI, including dynamic backgrounds that moved around a lot. For some, this was always going to be problematic as it could make you feel a little sick. The game had 9 playable characters and even had a prototype showcased at the California Extreme Show. Unfortunately, it never went past that, as the game was canned soon after 1996. The prototype is available though to play using a MAME emulator. The problem with the game seems to be that it was a very clear homage to Killer Instinct, which had come out 2 years before and had been very successful among fighting game fans. Vicious Circle had a lot of elements that were worryingly close to Killer Instinct, from art direction to characters. The character Edge is basically a budget Jago, while there was a female character whose aesthetic was similar to Orchid in KI. It might have been fun to see Vicious Circle and at least witness what the developers had in mind for their game. Let's talk about another Atari game that was set to release in the mid-90s that was also piggybacking off the popularity of another game. Do we have a pattern here? Thea Realm Fighters was heavily influenced by Mortal Kombat, which had shot to popularity in the early 90s and was considered a very innovative game with its use of digitized sprites for the game's characters. Thea did that, including some of the actors involved in Mortal Kombat. If MK was a tad uncomfortable due to its gore, Thea Realm Fighters seemed a bit more tame. The game was stated to have planned a 25-person roster, which at the time would have been quite significant, and a variety of game modes. But the plug was pulled in 1995, with some reports even stating that the game was as much as 90% complete. Seeing how similar the game was to Mortal Kombat, it was most likely simply going to be overshadowed by the more technically superior game, so maybe it was for the best.
Yo, what up guys? I'm here to talk briefly about DashFight's new partner, Scouters. So essentially Scouters is a new platform focused on building a tight-knit community around both traditional sports and digital sports. Esports especially benefits from Scouters because it allows tournament players to monetize their skills without having to depend on orgs or tournament prizes that are constantly fluctuating and are undependable. And it doesn't just benefit the players, it also benefits the fans, giving them more of a direct line of communication to their favorite players that is mutually beneficial to both parties. If you're interested in learning more about Scouters, a link to their page will be put in the description alongside an article that goes more in depth. Thank you guys for taking a few moments to listen. See you next time.
If you're into comics, you will probably remember Lobo. He was a space bounty hunter and merc whose heavy metal aesthetic and trash-talking ways endeared him to many. He was something of an antithesis to Superman, who was the clean-cut good boy. Well, they made a video game about him, and it was a fighting game. It was canned, and I guess we can thank them for pulling the plug, as the game will likely have caused a fair few DC fans some discontent. The game was published by Ocean Software and developed by Ocean of America Incorporated, with the idea to release it both on the Sega Genesis and the Super Nintendo. The game had only 6 characters, with most of them bearing very little resemblance to the characters in the comics. For instance, Shawla must be a reference to Princess Shawla, who is a rival to Lobo. The character Kringle seems to be a nod to the character of Santa Claus in the comics. The game had 3 modes: single player, versus, and training, and each character had 2 life bars like Killer Instinct, but in this game, the bars were placed on top of one another. By 1996, the game was booted out, and a year later, the Sega Genesis was no more. There are still versions of the game available to download, and if you are a fan of that sort of thing, have at it. Cybernauts was a futuristic fighting game being developed exclusively for the Genesis back in 1994 by developer Accolade. It was set in the future where humanity had developed genetically enhanced human beings who were now blessed with superpowers. But, as with most things, there were those who wanted to use their powers for good and those who wanted to be evil. The game was made with the same silicon graphics that Killer Instinct was made with, giving it a funny 3D feel. The game was never released, but it did gain a fair bit of popularity after its demise, as in 2019, Pico Interactive, an outfit who looked for retro games to bring them back to modern audiences, were able to lay their hands on the alpha ROM of Cybernauts. But the game was incomplete, so they started a Kickstarter with the idea being to release a comic around the characters of the game, and then the backers of the idea could also get the unfinished Cybernauts game. The comic, which was being done by Virtual Comics, was set to release in 2021. Unfortunately, the Kickstarter failed and the goal was not reached. This was the death knell for Cybernauts, and the game was to never be seen again. This 2D stylized fighter was being developed for the PS4 and PS Vita and was touted as a horror fantasy fighter. The game featured a variety of characters who had one thing in common. They were all outfitted with chainsaws. The story goes that the world they live in, called Nevermore, experienced a mystical incident that infected the population with chainsaws. The Kickstarter video featured some bits of the game, which were incomplete, but it showed some promise, and it was to have a 14 playable character roster at launch, and even had Matsuhiro Unoguchi, who was part of the motion design team for Tekken back in 1995, on their team as a technical lead. However, they never did make their goal and fell well short of it, meaning the game had to be cancelled. Their last social media post was in 2016, where they first said they were still alive before, rather sadly, responding to one fan's question on if the game was ever going to be a thing, saying, "Without funding and support, it will be a constant passion, but not full-time." The game was being made by Crazy Piranha, a Middle Eastern animation outfit with a dream to bring solid animation from an often neglected region to the world, in collaboration with Orijo Games. And it's a shame. It looked like it could have been a pretty fun title. Killing Bites was a manga series by Shinya Murata in 2013 with an anime series that came out in 2018. The game was to be released in 2016, 2 years before the anime, and was set within the world of Killing Bites, which revolves around a tournament where survival of the fittest is the only rule. The game was being developed for the PS4 and Vita, but things ground to a halt when the developers, Next Entertainment, were dissolved, and in 2017 they announced that all operations on the game had been halted and suspended. The game was supposed to be action beat 'em up, but with no actual footage of the game ever released, we can't say for sure where it sat as a genre. The anime got mostly middling reviews, so maybe the game wouldn't have been much of a big deal anyway. The 90s were the first golden era of fighting games, and we got incredible titles like Street Fighter II, Mortal Kombat, and Tekken. This meant that everyone was looking to make it big in fighting games, and when you're told that someone with experience working with Capcom and Bandai is involved in the making of a fighter, you sit up and take notice. So it was in the late 90s when Atari Games tried to make a Street Fighter X Tekken before it even existed. The name of the game was 10th Degree and was being worked on by industry mainstay James Goddard. Not much is known about the story of the game, but it was supposed to be a mashup between Street Fighter and Tekken styles, and looking at the game itself, it does bring to mind some of the stuff that Street Fighter EX did. There was a decent roster of characters already, and a test was carried out. It would seem that people weren't too impressed with the game, and so it got canned. It is still available for download using an emulator, but we'll never get to see the developer's vision play out. You know how we said Thea Realm Fighters was basically a bad knockoff of Mortal Kombat? Well, it was not the only one, and you could say that Tattoo Assassins was an even bigger culprit, as it seemed to take the elements of Mortal Kombat and just take it a notch higher. So they had a ton of fatalities, and the characters also had special moves that came out the rear end. It's not pretty, but they were trying to stand out somehow. There were also nudalities, which, while not explicit, are pretty weird to have in your fighting game. Tattoo Assassins was based on work done by Bob Gale of Back to the Future fame, and in honor of the writer, there's a fatality where the opponent gets crushed by a DeLorean. The game's story was about some magical tattoos that gave the wearer powers associated with the tattoo drawn on them. When a powerful warrior, Koldan, gets his tattoo, he abuses his power and becomes an oppressor. So other people are given tattoos to grant them powers and oppose Kul'dan. The game was to be released in 1994, but would end up never seeing the light of day as Sega bought out the developers of the game, Data East, and instead pushed for Virtua Fighter. This meant that even though basically finished, Tattoo Assassins was thrown on the rubbish heap of cancelled video games. It is difficult to talk about a list of cancelled fighting games and not mention Capcom Fighting All-Stars Cold Holder, which would have been a very welcome addition to the Capcom fighting game roster at the time. Back in 2001, the popular Capcom vs SNK 2 came out and was well received, and so another iteration of the game was planned. However, SNK were struggling financially and soon had to pack up, getting acquired by Aruse, a company who specialized in pachinko slots and had no interest in making fighting games. So many of the SNK employees simply jumped ship and worked with Capcom instead. With the Capcom vs SNK idea still hanging around, it was decided that instead of a crossover with SNK, why not just get fighters from other Capcom properties and create a fighter based on that? And so they did, and we saw characters from Darkstalkers, Rival Schools, and Final Fight all make an appearance on the roster. There were even a couple of new characters including Rook, Dee Dee, and Ingrid. Ingrid would show up in Capcom Fighting Evolution and Street Fighter Alpha 3 Max for the PlayStation Portable. The game's story was about a mysterious character named Death who had set a bomb in Metro City, and Mike Hager, the city's mayor, rallying around the fighters to help save the day. But to defuse the bomb, they needed to defeat 3 code holders, hence the game's name. Capcom Fighting All-Stars had all the markings of a great game, only it wasn't. When the game was taken for a location test, it got pretty negative reviews, which more or less halted any future plans to make the game. So it never came out. But we have since seen Final Fight characters appear in Street Fighter 4 and Rival School characters for Street Fighter 5. Maybe Street Fighter 6 could feature someone from Darkstalkers. A guy can dream, eh? And that's the end of today's video. We hope you liked it, and if you did, leave us a comment and follow DashFight for more engaging videos about your favorite fighting games, or you can join our amazing supporters on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.